Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we'll explore a case that shook the quiet suburbs of North Carolina to their core. The murder of Michelle Young, a story of betrayal, violence, and a marriage that ended in the most tragic way imaginable. So as we settle in, let me tell you about the events that unfolded on Birchleaf Drive in November 2006. Michelle Fisher Young was 29 years old in 2006, living what many would consider the American dream. She resided in a comfortable home on Birchleaf Drive in Raleigh, North Carolina, with her husband Jason and their 2.5-year-old daughter Cassidy. Michelle was pregnant with their second child, a boy they would never get to meet together as a family. The house on Birchleaf Drive sat in one of those neighborhoods where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed impossibly distant, where locked doors were more habit than necessity. Michelle had grown up believing in fairy tales, and for a time it seemed she was living one. She had met Jason Young through mutual friends, and their courtship had all the markers of a successful modern romance. Jason worked in sales, traveling frequently for business, while Michelle managed their home and cared for little Cassidy. From the outside, they appeared to be a thriving young family, planning for their future, building something lasting. But appearances, as we know, can be devastatingly deceiving. November 2nd, 2006 was a Thursday like any other. Michelle went about her routine with Cassidy, perhaps thinking about the baby growing inside her, perhaps planning for the weekend. Jason had left for what he said was a business trip to Virginia, a routine occurrence in their marriage. These trips were so common that Michelle had grown accustomed to managing alone, to putting Cassidy to bed by herself, to falling asleep in an empty house. The autumn air in North Carolina carried that particular chill that signals winter's approach. Leaves had turned their brilliant colors and begun to fall, carpeting lawns and sidewalks with nature's own farewell to the year. It was the kind of evening when you might build a fire, make hot chocolate, and settle in for a quiet night at home. Michelle followed her evening routine. She fed Cassidy dinner, gave her a bath, read her stories, and tucked her into bed. The house settled into the comfortable quiet of evening. Michelle, heavy with pregnancy, likely looked forward to rest. She changed into her nightgown, perhaps paused to feel the baby move inside her, and prepared for sleep. She had no way of knowing it would be her last night alive. Friday morning, November 3rd, brought no sounds from the Young house. No laughter of a toddler, no movement, no signs of life beginning another day. Michelle's sister, Meredith Fisher, had plans to spend time with Michelle and Cassidy that morning. When she arrived at the house and received no answer to her knocking, concern began to creep in. Meredith used her spare key to enter the house. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. The scene was immediately, horrifyingly wrong. Little Cassidy stood in the hallway, still in her pajamas, covered in blood that was not her own. She was unharmed but clearly traumatized, her small world forever altered by what she had witnessed. Throughout the house, investigators would later find tiny, bloody footprints, evidence that this child had wandered through a nightmare, alone and confused, for hours. Meredith followed the trail of blood and chaos to the master bedroom, where she discovered Michelle's body. The young mother had been brutally beaten and strangled. The violence inflicted upon her was so severe that it spoke of rage, of personal fury, of someone who knew her intimately enough to hate her completely. Michelle lay in a pool of her own blood, her engagement and wedding rings missing from her fingers. The unborn child she carried had died with her. In an instant, a family had been destroyed, and little Cassidy had become an orphan. When police arrived at the scene on Birchleaf Drive, they found evidence of a crime so brutal it stunned even experienced investigators. Michelle had suffered multiple skull fractures from repeated blows to her head. She had been strangled, her lips were severely bruised, several teeth had been knocked out, and she bore 13 lacerations on the back of her head. The medical examiner would later determine that Michelle had fought for her life. The injuries suggested a prolonged attack, one that continued even after she would have been incapacitated. This was not a quick death. This was not a crime of opportunity by a stranger. This was personal, intimate violence inflicted by someone consumed with rage. The house itself told a story of terror. Blood spatter painted the walls and ceiling of the bedroom. There were signs of struggle, evidence that Michelle had tried desperately to defend herself and her unborn child. Yet despite the brutality of the scene, there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever killed Michelle Young had either been let into the house willingly or had their own way of getting in. The absence of Michelle's wedding and engagement rings immediately struck investigators as significant. These weren't expensive pieces that a random burglar might target. They held sentimental value far beyond their monetary worth. Their removal seemed symbolic, personal, cruel. As investigators processed the scene, they began to piece together a timeline. Based on the blood evidence and Cassidy's condition, they determined that Michelle had been killed in the early morning hours of November 3rd. Sometime between 2 hours and 5 hours in a.m. This meant that little Cassidy had been alone in the house with her mother's body for several hours before her aunt's arrival. Jason Young was, by his own account, 70 miles away in Virginia when his wife was murdered. He claimed to be on a business trip, staying at a Hampton Inn in Hillsville. His alibi seemed straightforward. He had checked into the hotel, had receipts, had supposedly been seen by hotel staff. When police contacted Jason to inform him of Michelle's death, his reaction struck some as unusual. He seemed more concerned with the logistics of getting home than with the devastating news that his wife had been murdered and his daughter traumatized. But grief, investigators knew, manifests differently in different people. Some wail and collapse. Others become coldly practical. Jason returned to North Carolina to find his world turned upside down. His wife was dead, his daughter was in protective custody with her aunt, and he was suddenly the center of a murder investigation. He spoke with police, provided his account of his whereabouts, and began planning a funeral for the woman he claimed to love. But as investigators dug deeper into Jason's alibi, cracks began to appear. Hotel security cameras would become crucial to this case, though not in the way one might expect. The Hampton Inn in Hillsville had surveillance cameras that captured the parking lot and entrances. When investigators reviewed the footage, they made a startling discovery. Jason's car was seen leaving the hotel property at 12:46 a.m. on November 3rd, just hours before Michelle's murder. This single piece of evidence shattered Jason's carefully constructed alibi. If he had left the hotel in the early morning hours, he would have had just enough time to drive to Raleigh, commit the murder, and return to Virginia before dawn. The timing was tight but possible. Further investigation revealed additional troubling details. A gas station attendant in North Carolina would later testify that she had served Jason at her station at 5 a.m. on November 3rd, a claim that directly contradicted his story of being asleep in his Virginia hotel room. Police began to examine Jason's movements more closely. They discovered that he had paid for his hotel room in cash, unusual for a business trip that would normally be expensed. They found that he had driven to the hotel rather than flying, despite the distance, giving him a vehicle to make the round trip to Raleigh undetected. Most damning of all, the hotel's keycard records showed something deeply suspicious. Jason's keycard had been used to enter his hotel room at 3:25 a.m. on November 3rd. If he had truly been sleeping in that room all night, why would he need his keycard at that hour? The evidence suggested he had returned to the hotel in the early morning hours, slipping back into his room after a nighttime drive to North Carolina. As the investigation continued, a darker picture of the young marriage began to emerge. Friends and family members revealed that Jason and Michelle's relationship had been troubled for some time. There had been arguments, financial stress, and suggestions that Jason was unhappy with married life. Michelle had confided in close friends that she suspected Jason was having an affair. She had found evidence of his infidelity, including inappropriate communications with other women. The pregnancy with their second child, rather than bringing them closer together, seemed to have driven another wedge between them. Jason, according to testimony from friends, had expressed feeling trapped in his marriage. He complained about the financial burden of children, about the restrictions of family life, about feeling like he had married too young and missed out on other opportunities. To some who knew him, it seemed Jason viewed his family not as a blessing, but as a burden. The prosecution would later argue that Jason had grown to see murder as his only way out of a marriage he no longer wanted. Divorce would have meant alimony, child support, and financial obligations. Murder, if he could get away with it, would free him completely while potentially leaving him as the beneficiary of Michelle's life insurance policies. It took 3 years for Jason Young to be arrested and charged with his wife's murder. When the case finally went to trial in 2011, the prosecution laid out a compelling case based on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Jason had carefully planned Michelle's murder, creating an elaborate alibi while positioning himself to kill his wife and return to Virginia undetected. The evidence against Jason was extensive, but largely circumstantial. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence directly linking him to the crime scene. Instead, the prosecution relied on the hotel surveillance footage, the timing of events, testimony about the troubled marriage, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his alibi. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Jason was innocent, the victim of a rush to judgment by police who focused on him to the exclusion of other possible suspects. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, suggested that other intruders could have committed the crime, and argued that the prosecution's timeline was flawed. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. Little Cassidy herself. Though she was too young to testify in court, daycare workers testified about disturbing statements and behaviors the child had exhibited after her mother's death. Using dolls, Cassidy had repeatedly acted out scenes of Daddy hurting Mommy, mimicking violent actions that mirrored what investigators believed had happened that night. The first jury, however, could not reach a unanimous verdict. After days of deliberation, they declared themselves deadlocked, resulting in a mistrial. Jason Young walked free, though the charges against him remained. The state decided to retry Jason Young, and the second trial began in 2012. This time, the prosecution refined their arguments and presented their case more effectively. The evidence remained largely the same. The hotel surveillance footage, the timeline, the troubled marriage, and Cassidy's disturbing statements about her father hurting her mother. The defense continued to argue reasonable doubt, pointing to the lack of physical evidence directly linking Jason to the crime. They suggested alternative theories, questioned the reliability of witness testimony, and argued that the prosecution had not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But the jury in the second trial was convinced. After deliberating for just 6 hours, they returned with a guilty verdict. Jason Young was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of his wife, Michelle. The judge, in sentencing Jason to life in prison without the possibility of parole, made clear his view of the crime's brutality. He described how Jason had beaten Michelle so severely that he only stopped when he became exhausted. The judge noted the removal of Michelle's rings, describing it as a final act of cruelty, as if Jason viewed his wife as unworthy of the symbols of their marriage. Jason Young's conviction was not the end of his legal journey. His defense team appealed the verdict, arguing that there had been errors in the trial that warranted a new hearing. In 2014, the North Carolina Court of Appeals agreed, vacating his conviction and ordering a new trial. It seemed that Jason might escape justice after all. However, the state appealed this decision to the North Carolina Supreme Court. In 2015, the Supreme Court reversed the appellate court's decision, reinstating Jason's conviction. The highest court in North Carolina ruled that the original trial had been conducted fairly and that the evidence supported the jury's verdict. Jason Young remains in prison today, serving his sentence of life without parole. He continues to maintain his innocence, but the legal system has spoken. The courts have determined that he murdered his pregnant wife in cold blood, leaving his daughter orphaned and traumatized. The murder of Michelle Young sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Raleigh. It shattered the illusion of safety that many residents of Birchleaf Drive had cherished. It reminded everyone that the greatest dangers sometimes come not from strangers lurking in dark alleys, but from those closest to us, those we trust most completely. For Michelle's family, particularly her sister Meredith, who discovered the horrific scene, the trauma continues to this day. Meredith has worked tirelessly to ensure that Jason remained behind bars and that Michelle's memory was honored. She became an advocate for justice, speaking out about domestic violence and the warning signs that others might miss. Little Cassidy, now grown, has had to live with the knowledge that she witnessed her mother's murder at the hands of her own father. The psychological impact of such trauma on a young child cannot be overstated. Though she has been shielded from public attention as much as possible, her life was forever altered by that November night in 2006. The case has also become a study in how circumstantial evidence can be used to build a criminal case. While there was no smoking gun, no DNA evidence, no confession, the accumulation of suspicious circumstances, contradictory statements, and behavioral evidence was enough to convince two different juries of Jason's guilt. Legal experts have examined the case as an example of how modern surveillance technology, in this case hotel security cameras and keycard records, can provide crucial evidence in criminal investigations. The digital footprints we leave behind have become increasingly important in solving crimes, even when physical evidence is lacking. The murder of Michelle Young forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence and the masks that killers can wear. Jason Young was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a husband, a father, someone who had promised to love and protect the woman he ultimately killed. Michelle's death reminds us that domestic violence can escalate suddenly and fatally, often in homes that seem stable from the outside. The warning signs, the troubled marriage, the suspected infidelity, the expressions of feeling trapped were there, but like many victims of domestic violence, Michelle may not have fully recognized the danger she was in. The case also highlights the vulnerability of children in violent homes. Little Cassidy was not just a witness to her mother's murder. She was a victim who will carry these scars for life. The image of her tiny, bloody footprints throughout the house serves as a haunting reminder of how violence against one family member affects them all. Perhaps most tragically, Michelle's murder was entirely preventable. If Jason had chosen divorce over murder, two children would still have their mother, and Michelle would have had the chance to raise her son and watch her daughter grow up. Instead, a moment of rage and calculated violence destroyed multiple lives forever. As we reach the end of Michelle's story, we're left to consider whether justice has truly been served. Jason Young sits in a prison cell, convicted of murdering his wife and unborn child. The legal system has spoken. The appeals have been exhausted, and the case is officially closed. But for those who loved Michelle, justice may feel incomplete. Nothing can bring her back. Nothing can erase the trauma inflicted on little Cassidy. Nothing can restore the family that was destroyed that November night. The best that can be hoped for is that Jason's conviction sends a message that domestic violence will not be tolerated, that those who choose murder over divorce will face the full consequences of their actions. The murder of Michelle Young stands as a stark reminder that the most dangerous place for many women is not a dark alley or a bad neighborhood, but their own homes with their own husbands. It reminds us to pay attention to the warning signs, to take threats of violence seriously, to remember that behind every domestic violence statistic is a real person whose life was cut short by someone who claimed to love them. Michelle Fisher Young was 29 years old when she died. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, and a friend. She was pregnant with her second child, full of hopes and dreams for her family's future. She deserved to live, to raise her children, to grow old, surrounded by those who loved her. Instead, she became another casualty in the devastating epidemic of domestic violence. Another woman whose life was ended by the very person who had promised to cherish and protect her. Her story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder that evil can wear a familiar face and that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those we trust most. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Michelle Young, not as a victim, but as a person whose life had value, whose death was not in vain if it helps us recognize and prevent similar tragedies. Remember that behind every true crime story is a real human being, whose life was precious and whose loss leaves an unfillable void in the world. The house on Birchleaf Drive has new residents now. Life has moved on, as it always does. But somewhere in the North Carolina night, Michelle's memory lingers. A reminder of a life cut short, a family destroyed, and the price of violence in our homes and communities. Justice may have been served in the courtroom, but the real work of preventing future tragedies continues every day, in every relationship, in every home where someone feels trapped or threatened or afraid. Michelle's story is a call to action, a plea to recognize the signs of escalating violence before it's too late. And with that sobering reminder, we close this chapter of true crime. Tomorrow will bring another story, another tragedy, another reminder of humanity's capacity for both evil and justice. But tonight, as you settle into sleep, let Michelle's memory serve as both a warning and a hope. A warning about the dangers that can lurk in familiar places, and a hope that her story might prevent another family from experiencing the same devastating loss. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, Welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the rolling hills of East Tennessee, where the Great Smoky Mountains cast their protective shadow over the city of Knoxville, January 2007 was like any other winter month for most residents. Students were settling back into their routines at the University of Tennessee. The cold air carried the promise of spring still months away, and young couples throughout the city were making weekend plans, dreaming of their futures together. For 21-year-old Shannon Gale Christian and her boyfriend, 23-year-old Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr., Saturday, January 6, 2007 began like many others had before. They were a couple full of promise, with Shannon working toward her goals while Chris pursued his own path in life. Their relationship was one of those young loves that seemed to hold endless possibility, the kind that families hoped would bloom into something lasting and beautiful. Shannon Christian was the embodiment of youthful determination. At 21, she possessed the kind of bright optimism that college students often carry. That belief that the world was full of opportunities waiting to be seized. She had attended Farragut High School in Knoxville, where she had been known for her kindness and her infectious laugh. Those who knew her described a young woman who lit up rooms when she entered them, someone who made others feel welcome and valued in her presence. She came from a loving family who had watched her grow from a spirited child into a responsible young adult. Her parents had instilled in her the values of hard work and compassion, qualities that she carried with her as she navigated the complexities of young adulthood. Shannon was the type of person who remembered birthdays, who checked in on friends when they were struggling, who brought homemade cookies to work just because she thought her colleagues might enjoy them. Christopher Newsom, known to his friends and family as Chris, was 23 years old and possessed the quiet confidence that often comes with being slightly older and having experienced a bit more of life's ups and downs. He had graduated from Halls High School, also in the Knoxville area, where he had been well liked by both classmates and teachers. Chris had the kind of personality that drew people to him naturally. He was reliable, loyal, and had a dry sense of humor that could make even the most stressful situations seem manageable. Chris came from a close-knit family who had raised him to be respectful and hardworking. He was the kind of young man that parents hoped their daughters would bring home. The kind who would stand when adults entered the room and who always offered to help with dishes after dinner. His relationship with Shannon had brought joy to both their families, who had begun to see the young couple as a potential long-term match. Together, Shannon and Chris represented something beautiful about young love. They complemented each other perfectly, with Shannon's vivacious energy balanced by Chris's steady presence. They had been dating for some time, and their relationship had reached that comfortable stage where they knew each other's habits, finished each other's sentences, and could communicate with just a glance across a crowded room. On that fateful Saturday evening of January 6, 2007, Shannon and Chris had plans that many young couples in college towns make every weekend. A friend was celebrating a birthday, and there was to be a party at an apartment complex on Washington Pike in East Knoxville. It was the kind of casual gathering that serves as the backbone of young social life. Nothing fancy, just friends coming together to celebrate another year of life and enjoy each other's company. The couple had taken time to prepare for their evening out. Shannon, always thoughtful about her appearance, had chosen her outfit carefully. She wanted to look nice for their friend's celebration, but also comfortable enough to enjoy the evening. Chris, in his typical fashion, had probably spent less time getting ready, but still wanted to look presentable for the occasion. They had decided to take Shannon's Toyota 4Runner for the evening. It was a practical choice for the winter weather that January could bring to Tennessee, and the SUV provided a sense of security and reliability that many young people appreciate when venturing out for an evening of socializing. Neither of them could have imagined that this decision would play a role in the tragedy that was about to unfold. Before heading to the birthday party, the couple had made another stop that evening. They visited a friend at an apartment complex, spending some time catching up and enjoying the relaxed conversation that comes with close friendships. It was the kind of ordinary social interaction that fills the lives of young adults. Nothing momentous or extraordinary, just the comfortable rhythm of maintaining relationships and staying connected with their circle of friends. The apartment complex where they had stopped was in East Knoxville, an area that, like many urban neighborhoods, had its mix of students, young professionals, and working families. It wasn't considered particularly dangerous, though like any city area, it had its share of petty crime and occasional disturbances. For Shannon and Chris, it was simply another familiar location in their social geography, a place where friends lived and where they had spent time before without incident. As the evening progressed, they prepared to leave for the birthday party. The plan was straightforward: drive from the apartment complex to the party location, celebrate with their friend, and then return home safely, as they had done countless times before. It was a plan built on the assumption that most young people carry with them, that the world is generally safe, that bad things happen to other people, and a typical Saturday night out will end with nothing more dramatic than perhaps staying up too late and regretting it the next morning. As Shannon and Chris walked toward her Toyota 4Runner in the parking lot of the apartment complex on Washington Pike, the winter air carried the crispness that January nights in Tennessee often bring. The parking lot was dimly lit, with the kind of scattered lighting that is common in apartment complexes built more for functionality than for comprehensive security. It was approaching the late evening hours, and most residents were either settled in for the night or out for their own Saturday evening plans. What happened next would transform a routine departure into the beginning of a nightmare that would shock the Knoxville community and reverberate far beyond Tennessee's borders. As the couple approached their vehicle, they were suddenly confronted by armed assailants who demanded their car. Shannon Christian, age 21, and Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr., age 23, found themselves in a carjacking situation that quickly escalated beyond a simple vehicle theft. The perpetrators were not content with simply taking the SUV and fleeing. Instead, what should have been a property crime transformed into something far more sinister. The attackers, later identified as Lamarcus Davidson, George Thomas, Latavis Cobbins, Eric Boyd, and Vanessa Coleman, made the decision to kidnap both Shannon and Chris rather than simply steal the vehicle and escape. The decision to take the couple rather than simply steal their car suggests a level of premeditation and malicious intent that transforms this from a crime of opportunity into something far more calculated and evil. The fact that there were multiple perpetrators also indicates that this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision by a single desperate individual, but rather a coordinated action by a group of people who had chosen to embark on a path of violence. For Shannon and Chris, these moments must have been filled with confusion and terror. One moment they were walking to their car, discussing the birthday party they were about to attend, perhaps laughing about something that had happened during their visit with their friend. The next moment they were facing armed strangers who were making demands and threatening their safety. The transition from normalcy to nightmare must have been so sudden and shocking that it would have been difficult for them to fully comprehend what was happening. The perpetrators forced both Shannon and Chris into the Toyota 4Runner, effectively taking control of both the vehicle and its occupants. This decision marked the point of no return in what would become one of the most heinous crimes in Knoxville's history. The SUV that had been intended to transport the couple safely to a birthday celebration had instead become their prison, carrying them toward an ordeal that would ultimately cost them their lives. The perpetrators transported Shannon and Chris to a rental house that served as their base of operations. This location, which would become the scene of unimaginable horrors, was not randomly chosen. It was a place where the criminals felt they could operate without immediate detection or interference. The rental house represented a significant escalation in the crime. Rather than committing a quick carjacking and releasing their victims, the perpetrators had made the conscious decision to take the couple to a secondary location. In criminal psychology, this transportation to a secondary location is often considered one of the most ominous developments in any violent crime, as it typically indicates that the perpetrators have more extensive criminal intentions beyond simple robbery. The house itself was located in East Knoxville, not far from where the initial carjacking had occurred. It was the kind of property that often serves as temporary housing for people who are either transitioning between more permanent situations or who are involved in activities that make traditional rental arrangements difficult. The anonymity that such properties provide can make them attractive to people who wish to avoid scrutiny from neighbors or law enforcement. For Shannon and Chris, being brought to this location must have represented a terrifying realization that their situation was far more serious than they might have initially hoped. Any possibility that this was simply a carjacking that would end with their release was eliminated by the decision to bring them to this house. The isolation of the location, combined with the fact that they were now in a space controlled entirely by their captors, would have made escape seem virtually impossible. The rental house would become the scene of a prolonged ordeal that would last for hours. During this time, both Shannon and Chris would suffer unimaginable torture, sexual assault, and ultimately murder. The details of what occurred within those walls are so disturbing that even seasoned investigators and prosecutors struggled to process the level of cruelty and depravity that was inflicted upon these two innocent young people. The ordeal that Christopher Newsom endured at the rental house represents some of the most disturbing aspects of this already horrific crime. The young man who had begun the evening, simply planning to attend a friend's birthday party, found himself subjected to torture and abuse that defies comprehension. The details of his suffering are so severe that they challenge our understanding of human cruelty and the depths to which some individuals can sink. Christopher was subjected to prolonged physical and sexual assault by multiple perpetrators. The attacks were not quick or merciful, but rather extended over a period of time that must have felt like an eternity to the victim. The psychological trauma of being helpless while experiencing such violence, combined with the knowledge that his girlfriend was also being victimized, adds layers of anguish that are difficult to even contemplate. After enduring hours of torture and assault, Christopher was removed from the house. He was taken to a nearby area where he was murdered. Hours later, a railroad worker discovered the burned remains of Newsom. He was barefoot with hands bound by a shoelace. The discovery of his body would be the first indication to authorities that something terrible had occurred. The fact that Christopher's hands were bound with a shoelace provides a chilling detail about the calculated nature of his murder. This was not a crime of passion or a situation that escalated beyond the perpetrator's control. It was a deliberate and methodical killing that involved binding the victim before taking his life. The decision to burn the body afterwards shows an attempt to destroy evidence and complicate the investigation. The railroad worker who discovered Christopher's remains was simply going about his routine duties when he encountered a sight that would haunt him forever. The discovery of a burned body is traumatic under any circumstances, but knowing that this person had suffered so terribly before their death adds an additional layer of horror to an already devastating situation. Christopher's murder marked the end of a young life that had held so much promise. At 23 years old, he had been at an age where the future seemed full of possibilities. He had graded from high school, built meaningful relationships, and was building toward what should have been a long and fulfilling life. Instead, his life was cut short in the most brutal way imaginable, leaving his family and friends to grapple with not only the loss of someone they loved, but also the horrific manner in which he had died. While Christopher's murder was discovered first, Shannon Christian's fate was even more prolonged and torturous. After witnessing or being aware of what had happened to her boyfriend, she was kept alive for additional time during which she endured continued sexual assault, torture, and degradation. The knowledge that Chris was gone, combined with her own ongoing victimization, must have created a level of psychological torment that is beyond human comprehension. Shannon was subjected to repeated sexual assaults by multiple perpetrators over an extended period. The young woman who had been full of life and optimism just hours before was now trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. The prolonged nature of her ordeal meant that she suffered not only physical pain but also the psychological agony of knowing that her situation was hopeless and that the people she loved would never see her alive again. The details of Shannon's suffering are so disturbing that even during the subsequent trials, prosecutors had to carefully consider how much detail to present to the jury. The evidence of what she endured was so graphic and upsetting that it challenged the emotional capacity of everyone involved in the legal proceedings, from investigators to attorneys to jurors. After enduring this prolonged torture, Shannon was murdered by her captors. On January 9, 2007, authorities found her body near Davidson's rental property, 2 blocks away from where they located her vehicle. The discovery of her body 3 days after the carjacking marked the end of a search that had consumed law enforcement resources and captured the attention of the local community. The location where Shannon's body was found, near the rental property where she had been held captive, suggests that even in death, she was not afforded dignity or respect by her killers. The callous disposal of her body shows a complete disregard for her humanity and for the pain that her death would cause to her family and friends. Shannon's death represented not just the end of her young life, but also the destruction of all the dreams and plans she had been building. At 21, she had been at a stage in life where she was discovering who she was becoming as an adult, exploring her capabilities, and forming relationships that she hoped would last a lifetime. All of that potential was extinguished by individuals who chose to commit acts of incomprehensible evil. The discovery of Christopher's burned remains by the railroad worker initiated one of the most intensive investigations in Knoxville's history. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene where Christopher's body had been found, they immediately recognized that they were dealing with something far more serious than a typical homicide. The evidence of torture, the binding of the victim's hands, and the attempt to destroy evidence through burning all pointed to a level of criminal sophistication and depravity that demanded the full attention of multiple investigative agencies. The initial challenge for investigators was establishing the identity of the victim. The burning of the body had destroyed many of the features that would normally allow for quick identification, requiring forensic specialists to work carefully to determine who this person was and how they had died. Once Christopher's identity was established, investigators began the process of trying to understand what had happened to him and whether there were other victims. The investigation quickly expanded when it became clear that Christopher had not been alone on the evening he was killed. His girlfriend, Shannon Christian, was reported missing by her family when she failed to return home or respond to attempts to contact her. The realization that a young couple had been victimized together added urgency to the investigation and suggested that the crimes might be even more extensive than initially thought. Investigators began retracing the couple's movements on the evening of January 6th, speaking with friends and family members to establish a timeline of their activities. The last known sighting of the couple was at the apartment complex on Washington Pike, where they had been visiting a friend before planning to attend a birthday party. This location became the focus of intensive investigation as authorities tried to determine exactly what had happened in the parking lot that night. The discovery of Shannon's Toyota 4Runner became a crucial piece of evidence in the investigation. The vehicle was found 2 blocks away from where her body would eventually be discovered, near Davidson's rental property. The location of the SUV provided investigators with a geographic area to focus their efforts and suggested that the perpetrators had some connection to that neighborhood. Forensic specialists began processing both the vehicle and the crime scenes, looking for DNA evidence, fingerprints, and any other physical evidence that might lead them to the perpetrators. The rental house where the crimes had occurred became a major focus of the investigation, with specialists spending days carefully documenting and collecting evidence from every room. 2 days after the discovery of Christopher's body, authorities found 2 suspects, Davidson's brother Latalvis Cobbins and his friend George Thomas. This initial breakthrough in the case came through a combination of traditional investigative work and the analysis of physical evidence found at the crime scenes. The identification of Lamarcus Davidson as a central figure in the crimes was crucial to the investigation's progress. Davidson, whose rental property had been used as the location where the torture and murders occurred, quickly became the primary suspect in the case. His criminal history and known associates provided investigators with a roadmap for identifying the other individuals who had participated in these heinous crimes. In total, 5 people were eventually identified as participants in the kidnapping, torture, and murders. Lamarcus Davidson, George Thomas, Latalvis Cobbins, Eric Boyd, and Vanessa Coleman. The fact that so many people were involved in these crimes made the case particularly complex from an investigative standpoint, as authorities had to determine each person's specific role and level of culpability. Lamarcus Davidson emerged as the apparent leader of the group and was determined to be the primary orchestrator of the crimes. His rental house had served as the location where the torture and murders occurred, and evidence suggested that he had been the driving force behind the decision to kidnap the couple rather than simply steal their vehicle. George Thomas and Latalvis Cobbins were identified as active participants in both the carjacking and the subsequent torture and murders. Their involvement was established through both physical evidence and witness testimony, painting a picture of individuals who had willingly participated in acts of extreme violence and depravity. Eric Boyd's role in the crimes was somewhat different from the others, but no less significant. Evidence suggested that he had been involved in the initial carjacking and had played a role in facilitating the subsequent crimes. His participation demonstrated how quickly a group of individuals could organize to commit acts of extraordinary evil. Vanessa Coleman was the only female among the perpetrators, and her role in the crimes added another layer of complexity to the case. Evidence established that she had been present during the torture and murders and had participated in the abuse of both victims. Her involvement challenged some people's preconceptions about women's participation in violent crimes and demonstrated that the capacity for cruelty is not limited by gender. The arrest and charging of the 5 perpetrators marked the beginning of a legal process that would span more than a decade and involve multiple trials, appeals, and sentencing hearings. The trials that followed thrust the victims' families into the national spotlight again and again. In all, 5 people were brought to justice in the couple's murders. The complexity of the case, with multiple defendants and numerous charges ranging from carjacking to kidnapping to rape to murder, meant that the legal proceedings would be extensive. and emotionally draining for everyone involved. The families of Chan and Christian and Christopher Newsom would have to endure years of hearings, trials, and appeals, repeatedly reliving the details of their loved ones' final hours. Little Vis Cobbins was among the first to face trial. On August 25, 2009, Little Vis Cobbins was found guilty of the murders of Chan and Christian and Christopher Newsom. Cobbins faced the possibility of the death penalty because he was convicted of first-degree felony murder in the case of Christian. The trial proceedings were particularly difficult because of the graphic nature of the evidence that had to be presented. Jurors were forced to hear detailed testimony about the torture and sexual assaults that both victims had endured, creating an emotional burden that extended far beyond the immediate families of the victims. The evidence was so disturbing that it challenged the psychological resilience of everyone involved in the legal process. George Thomas was convicted on all counts, including more than a dozen counts of felony murder and 2 counts of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The multiple counts reflected the various ways in which the law classified the different aspects of his criminal behavior, ensuring that he would face appropriate punishment for each element of his participation in these crimes. Vanessa Coleman was convicted on charges of facilitation of the murder, kidnapping, rape, and theft of Christian. Her conviction on facilitation charges rather than direct murder charges reflected the court's determination of her specific role in the crimes, though her participation was still deemed serious enough to warrant significant criminal penalties. Lamarcus Davidson was one of the 5 people convicted of the murders and was given the death penalty. As the apparent ringleader of the group, and the person whose property had been used for the torture and murders, Davidson received the most severe sentence available under Tennessee law. Eric Boyd's case took longer to resolve than the others. 11 years after the murders, Thomas threw everything on Boyd, according to investigators. On August 13, 2018, Boyd was found guilty of 36 charges connected to the kidnap, rape, and murder of Shannon and Chris. He received 2 life sentences plus 90 years in prison. The case was widely described as the most horrifying murder case to ever happen in East Tennessee. The sheer brutality of the crimes, combined with the young age of the victims and the random nature of their selection, created a sense of vulnerability and fear throughout the Knoxville community. People began to question their assumptions about safety, and to recognize that terrible things could happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. The families of Chan and Christian and Christopher Newsom faced the impossible task of trying to rebuild their lives after losing their children in such a horrific manner. The grief of losing a child is already considered one of the most difficult experiences a person can endure. But when that loss occurs through extreme violence and torture, the psychological impact becomes almost unbearable. Gary Christian, Shannon's father, expressed the rage and desire for justice that consumed him for years after his daughter's murder, saying, "I wanted to kill all of them, period. Didn't care how, didn't care when, just wanted to do it." While Christian said the last 18 years have been a struggle, he's gained peace by focusing on other aspects of his life. The legal proceedings, while necessary for justice, also meant that the families had to endure years of reliving the details of their loved ones' final hours. Every trial, every appeal, every hearing brought back the pain and forced them to confront again and again the reality of what had happened to Shannon and Chris. The American legal system's emphasis on due process, while important for protecting the rights of defendants, can create an extended period of suffering for victims' families. The case also highlighted broader issues about crime, safety, and justice that resonated far beyond Knoxville. The random nature of the victims' selection — they were simply young people going about their normal lives when they encountered these criminals — served as a reminder that violent crime can touch anyone, regardless of their background, behavior, or precautions. Even decades after the murders, legal proceedings related to the case continue to unfold. As recently as June 2025, Lamarcus Davidson, who was sentenced to death for his role in the murders, appeared in court as part of ongoing appeals processes. These continued proceedings mean that the families of the victims cannot achieve complete closure, as they must remain prepared for the possibility of new developments in the case. The death penalty aspect of Davidson's case has meant that his legal appeals will likely continue for years to come, as death penalty cases typically involve extensive review processes. While these reviews are intended to ensure that the ultimate punishment is only applied in appropriate cases, they also mean that the victims' families must continue to engage with the legal system decades after their loved ones were killed. The prolonged nature of these legal proceedings reflects both the complexity of death penalty cases and the commitment of the justice system to ensuring that all defendants receive appropriate legal representation and due process. However, this thoroughness comes at an emotional cost to the victims' families, who must continue to relive their trauma each time the case returns to court. For the Knoxville community, these ongoing legal proceedings serve as periodic reminders of one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. Each court appearance, each news article about appeals, brings back memories of the shock and horror that gripped the area when the details of these crimes first became public. Tuesday marks 18 years since the torture slayings of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom in Knoxville. The passage of time has not diminished the impact of these crimes on the community or the ongoing pain experienced by the victims' families. Annual remembrances of Channon and Chris serve not only to honor their memories, but also to ensure that they are remembered for who they were as people, not just as victims of terrible crimes. Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom are remembered as young people who embodied the hopes and dreams that all parents have for their children. They were at stages in their lives where they were discovering their adult identities, building meaningful relationships, and planning for futures that seemed full of unlimited possibility. Their deaths represent not only the loss of two individuals, but also the destruction of all the contributions they might have made to their families, their community, and the world. The way in which Channon and Chris are remembered reflects the broader human need to find meaning and purpose even in the face of senseless tragedy. Their families and friends have worked to ensure that they are remembered as the loving, hopeful, vibrant young people they were, rather than being defined solely by the circumstances of their deaths. The impact of their murders extends beyond their immediate families to include friends, classmates, co-workers, and community members who were touched by their lives or moved by their story. The ripple effects of violent crime affect entire communities, changing how people think about safety, trust, and the fundamental goodness of humanity. The murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for evil that exists in the world. The level of cruelty and depravity demonstrated by their killers challenges our understanding of human nature and raises difficult questions about what drives some individuals to commit acts of such extraordinary violence. These crimes serve as a reminder that evil is not an abstract concept, but a real force that can touch any life at any moment. The randomness of how Channon and Chris were selected as victims, they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, underscores the reality that terrible things can happen to good people who have done nothing to deserve such treatment. At the same time, the successful prosecution of all 5 perpetrators demonstrates that justice, while sometimes slow and imperfect, can ultimately prevail. The years of dedicated work by investigators, prosecutors, and court personnel ensured that those responsible for these crimes were held accountable for their actions. The legal system, despite its limitations and the pain it sometimes causes to victims' families, served its fundamental purpose of ensuring that criminal behavior has consequences. The sentences imposed on the perpetrators, including death sentences and multiple life sentences, reflect society's recognition that some acts are so heinous that they warrant the most severe punishments available. While no punishment can undo the harm that was done or bring back Channon and Chris, the legal accountability serves important functions in affirming societal values and potentially deterring others from similar acts. Nearly 2 decades after these murders occurred, they continue to raise questions that have no easy answers. How do we protect innocent people from random acts of violence? What factors contribute to the development of individuals capable of such extreme cruelty? How do we balance the need for justice with the healing process for victims' families? The case also highlights the ongoing challenges faced by the criminal justice system in dealing with the most serious violent crimes. The years of trials, appeals, and legal proceedings demonstrate both the thoroughness of the system's approach to ensuring justice and the emotional toll that this thoroughness takes on everyone involved. For the families of Channon and Chris, these questions are not academic, but deeply personal. They have had to find ways to continue living while carrying the knowledge of what their loved ones endured. Their strength in surviving such tragedy and their commitment to seeing justice served provide inspiration to others facing similar losses. The broader community has also had to grapple with the knowledge that such terrible things can happen in their midst. The sense of safety and security that most people take for granted was shattered by these crimes, forcing individuals and families to reconsider their assumptions about the world around them. As we reflect on the story of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, we are reminded of both the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing the time we have with those we love. Their story serves as a tragic reminder that tomorrow is never guaranteed, and that the simple act of leaving home for an evening out can sometimes lead to encounters with evil that we never could have imagined. The young couple who left home that January evening in 2007, planning nothing more than to attend a friend's birthday party, could never have anticipated that their lives were about to be cut short in such a brutal manner. Their story forces us to confront the reality that safety is not guaranteed, that evil exists in the world, and that terrible things can happen to good people. Yet their story also demonstrates the power of love, memory, and the human commitment to justice. The dedication of law enforcement officers who work tirelessly to solve these crimes. The persistence of prosecutors who ensured that justice was served, and the strength of family members who endured years of legal proceedings, all testify to the fundamental human belief that life has meaning and that wrongs must be made right. Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom were more than victims of a terrible crime. They were young people with dreams, hopes, and the capacity to love and be loved. They were daughters and sons, friends and partners, individuals who brought joy to others and who contributed to their communities in ways both large and small. As we remember their story, we honor not only their memory, but also the memories of all those who have been lost to senseless violence. Their deaths remind us of the preciousness of life, the importance of treating each other with kindness and respect, and the need to work together to create a world where such tragedies become increasingly rare. The story of Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom is one of the darkest chapters in Knoxville's history, but it is also a story about the triumph of justice over evil, the power of love to endure even the most terrible losses, and the strength of the human spirit to find meaning and purpose, even in the face of senseless tragedy. In the end, while we cannot undo what happened to these two young people, we can ensure that their memories live on, that their story serves as a reminder of the importance of protecting the innocent, and that their deaths were not in vain if they inspire us to work toward a world where such cruelty becomes unthinkable. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we travel to the rolling hills and peaceful farmlands of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It's a place where century-old stone houses dot the landscape, where the Delaware River winds through quaint townships, and where families have farmed the same fertile soil for generations. This is a story that unfolded in the summer of 2017, when the tranquil countryside became the setting for one of the most shocking criminal cases in the region's history. The story begins with 4 young men, each in the prime of their lives, each with dreams and families who loved them. They would become known as the Lost Boys of Bucks County, though their names deserve to be remembered. Dean Finocchiaro, 19 years old from Middletown Township. Mark Sturgis, 22 from Pennsburg in neighboring Montgomery County. Thomas Mio, 21 from Plumstead Township. And Jimmy Taro Patrick, just 19, from Newtown Township. These were not strangers to each other, though they weren't particularly close friends either. They moved in similar circles in the small communities that make up Bucks County. They were young men navigating that uncertain time between adolescence and adulthood. Some working, some in school, all trying to figure out their place in the world. Dean Finocchiaro was known for his infectious smile and his love of skateboarding. He had struggled with some personal challenges, but was working to get his life on track. His family described him as someone who could light up a room when he walked in. Despite the difficulties he faced, Mark Sturgis was remembered as gentle and kind-hearted, someone who would help anyone who needed it. Tim Mao was described by those who knew him as loyal and funny, the type of person who would drive hours just to help a friend. And Jimmy Patrick, the youngest of the 4, was remembered for his creativity and his dreams of making something of himself. In early July 2017, as the summer heat settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, these 4 young men would each separately receive what seemed like an ordinary invitation. Someone they knew or knew of was offering to sell them marijuana. In the casual economy of young adults, this wasn't unusual. Small-scale marijuana deals happened regularly among acquaintances and friends of friends. The person making these offers was Cosmo DiNardo, a 20-year-old from a well-to-do family in Bensalem Township. The DiNardo family owned substantial property, including a sprawling 90-acre farm in Sulbury Township, complete with rolling fields, wooded areas, and several outbuildings. Cosmo's parents had worked hard to provide for their family, and by all external appearances they had achieved the American dream. But Cosmo DiNardo was not what he appeared to be. Behind the facade of a young man from a successful family lay a troubled individual whose mental state had been deteriorating for some time. He had a history of psychiatric issues and had been in and out of treatment facilities. Those who knew him described someone who seemed increasingly unstable, prone to bizarre behavior and violent outbursts. DiNardo had been involved in various scrapes with the law, including gun charges that had been dismissed on technicalities. His family had money for good lawyers, and consequences had a way of not sticking. This pattern may have contributed to a sense that he was untouchable, that he could act without facing real repercussions. The events that would define the Lost Boys case began on July 5, 2017. It was a Wednesday, and the summer heat was building toward what would be a sweltering weekend. Jimmy Patrick, the creative 19-year-old from Newtown, received a message about buying marijuana. The deal was supposed to take place at the DiNardo family farm in Solebury. Jimmy told his family he was going out to meet someone about a potential purchase. It seemed routine enough that his family didn't think twice about it. He drove his car to what he thought would be a simple transaction, and never returned home. When Jimmy didn't come back that night, his family initially wasn't alarmed. He was 19, after all, and young people sometimes stay out later than expected. But when Thursday passed with no word from him, and his phone went straight to voicemail, concern began to build. On Friday, July 7, another young man received a similar invitation. Dean Finocchiaro, a skateboarding enthusiast from Middletown Township, was offered a deal on marijuana. Like Jimmy, Dean thought he was heading to a routine purchase at the DiNardo farm. He told friends where he was going and drove off in his car, a silver Toyota. Dean's family became worried much more quickly than Jimmy's had. Dean had been working hard to stay on track, and disappearing without contact was completely out of character for him. By Saturday morning, they were making calls and reaching out to his friends, trying to piece together where he might have gone. That same Saturday, July 8, Mark Sturgis received his invitation. The 22-year-old from Pennsburg was the oldest of the four victims, and perhaps the most cautious, but the promise of a good deal on marijuana was tempting enough to draw him to the same location where Jimmy and Dean had vanished. Mark drove to the DiNardo farm in his silver Nissan Altima, expecting to complete his purchase and return home. His family would later say that Mark had mentioned the trip to them, noting he was going to meet someone in Bucks County about buying some marijuana. It was the last time anyone would see Mark alive. By Sunday, July 9, 3 families in Bucks County were frantically worried about their missing sons. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. 3 young men, all missing after going to purchase marijuana, all in the same time frame. The families began reaching out to each other and to local law enforcement. But the nightmare wasn't over. On that Sunday, Thomas Mill received his own invitation to what would be his final drug deal. Tom, the loyal 21-year-old from Plumstead Township, drove to the DiNardo farm just as the others had done. His car, a blue Nissan Sentra, would be found days later, leading investigators closer to the truth. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office began treating the disappearances as connected cases. 4 young men, all missing within days of each other, all last known to be going to the same general area for similar reasons. This was no longer a series of coincidences. The investigation intensified rapidly. Detectives began mapping the connections between the missing men and trying to identify who might have contacted them about drug purchases. They quickly focused on Cosmo DiNardo, whose name kept coming up in their inquiries. DiNardo initially denied any knowledge of the missing men, but his story quickly began falling apart under questioning. Investigators discovered that he had been in contact with each of the victims around the times they disappeared. Cell phone records showed communications between DiNardo and each of the 4 young men. More damning evidence emerged when investigators began searching the DiNardo family property. The 90-acre farm in Solebury Township became a crime scene, as teams of forensic experts combed through fields, outbuildings, and wooded areas. On July 12, 2017, investigators made a grisly discovery. In a 12-foot deep pit on the DiNardo property, they found human remains. The bodies were burned almost beyond recognition, but forensic analysis would eventually confirm the worst fears of 4 families. Under intense interrogation, Cosmo DiNardo's facade finally crumbled. In exchange for being spared the death penalty, he agreed to confess to the murders and provide details about what had happened to the 4 young men. DiNardo's confession revealed the horrific truth about the Lost Boys of Bucks County. Each victim had believed they were coming to the farm for a simple marijuana purchase. Instead, they had walked into carefully planned murders. According to DiNardo's confession, he had been assisted in at least some of the murders by his cousin Sean Kratz, who was also 20 years old at the time. The two cousins had lured their victims to the isolated farm property, where they were shot and killed. The details of the murders were particularly disturbing. DiNardo claimed that he and Kratz had planned to rob the victims of their money and vehicles, but had decided to kill them to avoid being identified. The young men were shot with firearms that DiNardo had illegally obtained, despite being prohibited from owning guns due to his previous mental health issues. After the murders, DiNardo and Kratz had attempted to dispose of the evidence. In the most callous way possible, they had burned the bodies in a large metal container on the farm property, then buried the remains in the deep pit where investigators eventually found them. The vehicles belonging to the victims were also dealt with in a systematic way. Some were sold, others were hidden or destroyed. DiNardo and Kratz had treated the entire operation like a business, planning each step to maximize their profit and minimize their chances of being caught. What made the case even more disturbing was the apparent randomness of the victim selection. Dean, Mark, Tom, and Jimmy weren't chosen because of any personal animosity or specific conflict with DiNardo. They were simply young men who responded to offers for marijuana purchases. Their deaths seemed to serve no purpose beyond DiNardo's desire for money, and perhaps some twisted form of excitement or control. The psychiatric evaluation of Cosmo DiNardo revealed a young man whose mental illness had progressed into dangerous territory. He had been diagnosed with various conditions over the years, including schizophrenia, and had been in and out of treatment facilities. However, mental illness alone didn't explain the calculated nature of his crimes. Some experts who examined the case suggested that DiNardo exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, in addition to his other psychiatric diagnoses. The combination of mental illness and antisocial traits may have created a perfect storm that led to the murders. Sean Kratz, DiNardo's cousin and alleged accomplice, initially maintained his innocence. Unlike DiNardo, Kratz refused plea deals and insisted on going to trial. His defense team argued that he had been manipulated by DiNardo and hadn't been a willing participant in the murders. However, the evidence against Kratz was substantial. Cell phone records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence all pointed to his involvement in at least some aspects of the crimes. The prosecution painted a picture of two cousins who had worked together to plan and execute the murders. The impact on the families of the victims was devastating and long-lasting. 4 sets of parents had to grapple with the loss of their sons in the most horrific way possible. Not only had their children been murdered, but their bodies had been desecrated and hidden, prolonging the agony of not knowing what had happened to them. The Finocchiaro family established a foundation in Dean's memory to help other families dealing with mental health and addiction issues. They channeled their grief into trying to prevent other tragedies, recognizing that both the victims and perpetrators in this case had struggled with various personal challenges. Mark Sturgis's family remembered him as someone who always tried to help others, and they worked to keep his memory alive through acts of kindness and community service. They spoke about how Mark's gentleness and willingness to help anyone in need made his senseless death even more difficult to understand. Tomio's family focused on remembering the joy and loyalty that had defined their son's life. They spoke about how Tom would drop everything to help a friend, and how his sense of humor had brought light to everyone around him. The randomness of his death was particularly difficult for them to process. Jimmy Patrick's family remembered his creativity and his dreams of making something meaningful of his life. At just 19, Jimmy had been at the beginning of his adult journey, and his family was left to wonder what he might have accomplished if he had been given the chance to grow and mature. The case also had a profound impact on the broader Bucks County community. The area was known for its safety and rural charm, and the idea that such brutal murders could happen on a family farm shattered many residents' sense of security. Local law enforcement praised the thorough investigation that led to DiNardo's confession and Kratz's arrest. The case became a model for how to handle complex multi-victim investigations, particularly when the crime scene spans a large rural area. The legal proceedings moved relatively quickly once DiNardo agreed to cooperate. On May 16, 2018, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In court, he offered an apology to the families, saying he wished he could take back what had happened, though his words provided little comfort to those who had lost so much. Sean Kratz's case took longer to resolve. He rejected multiple plea deals and insisted on going to trial. In February 2019, he was convicted on charges related to the murders, and sentenced to life in prison. The jury rejected arguments that he had been manipulated by DiNardo, finding that he had been a willing participant in the crimes. The DiNardo family farm. Once a symbol of agricultural success and generational wealth, became a notorious crime scene that would be forever associated with the murders. The property was eventually sold, but the stigma of what had happened there would likely persist for generations. In the years following the murders, the case continued to generate interest from true crime enthusiasts and media producers. The story had all the elements that fascinate people about criminal cases. Wealthy perpetrators, innocent victims, a rural setting that seemed safe, and crimes that defied easy explanation. Several documentaries and television specials were produced about the Lost Boys of Bucks County, each trying to make sense of what had driven Cosmo DiNardo to commit such brutal acts. The case was featured on Investigation Discovery and other true crime networks, reaching national audiences who were shocked by the senselessness of the murders. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight the importance of early intervention and proper treatment for young people showing signs of psychiatric distress. They pointed to DiNardo's history of mental health issues and legal troubles as red flags that might have been addressed more effectively before they escalated to violence. The case also sparked discussions about gun control and the ability of people with mental health issues to obtain firearms. DiNardo had been legally prohibited from owning guns due to a psychiatric history, but he had still managed to acquire the weapons used in the murders through illegal channels. Some experts argued that the case demonstrated the need for better enforcement of existing gun laws, while others suggested that more comprehensive background check systems might have prevented DiNardo from accessing firearms. However, these policy debates offered little comfort to the families who had lost their sons. The Lost Boys case also highlighted the risks associated with small-scale drug transactions among young people. While marijuana laws were changing in many states, including Pennsylvania's eventual adoption of medical marijuana, the illegal market continued to put young people at risk of encountering dangerous individuals like DiNardo. Parents and community leaders used the case as a cautionary tale about the risks of meeting strangers for any kind of transaction, particularly drug purchases. The seemingly routine nature of what the victims thought they were doing made their deaths even more tragic and frightening for other families. As time passed, the families of the victims worked to ensure that their sons would be remembered for their lives rather than their deaths. They shared stories about Dean's skateboarding skills and his ability to make people laugh even during difficult times. They talked about Mark's kindness and his willingness to help anyone who needed it, regardless of whether he knew them well. They remembered Tom's loyalty to his friends and his infectious sense of humor that could brighten even the darkest days. And they celebrated Jimmy's creativity and his dreams of making a positive impact on the world around him. The memorial services for the four young men drew hundreds of people from throughout Bucks County and beyond. The outpouring of support demonstrated how deeply the losses had affected not just their immediate families, but their extended communities. Local schools implemented new programs to educate students about personal safety and the risks of meeting strangers for any reason. Guidance counselors received additional training on how to identify and help students who might be struggling with mental health issues or substance abuse problems. The case also led to improvements in how law enforcement agencies in the region coordinate when dealing with multiple missing persons cases. The rapid identification of connections between the four disappearances was credited with helping investigators solve the case relatively quickly, but officials recognized that their protocols could be enhanced for future situations. Forensic techniques used in the investigation became case studies for law enforcement training programs. The careful excavation and analysis of the burial site provided valuable experience for investigators who might face similar challenges in other cases. The psychological profile developed for Cosmo DiNardo also became a reference point for experts studying the intersection of mental illness and violent crime. While mental illness rarely leads to violence, DiNardo's case provided insights into the specific combination of factors that might increase the risk of dangerous behavior. As the 5th anniversary of the murders approached in 2022, local media revisited the case and its lasting impact on the community. Families of the victims participated in some interviews, sharing how they had worked to rebuild their lives while keeping their sons' memories alive. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office noted that the case had become a reference point for how to handle complex investigations involving multiple victims and extensive crime scenes. The cooperation between local law enforcement, state police, and federal agencies was praised as a model for future cases. Mental health professionals continue to study DiNardo's case as an example of how psychiatric conditions can sometimes progress to dangerous levels if not properly treated. They emphasize the importance of family involvement in treatment and the need for better systems to prevent people with serious mental illness from accessing firearms. The story of the Lost Boys of Bucks County serves as a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can intersect with extraordinary evil. Dean, Mark, Tom, and Jimmy were simply young men trying to navigate their way through life, making the kinds of decisions that millions of their peers make every day. They had no way of knowing that their routine decision to purchase marijuana would lead them to encounter someone whose mental illness and criminal intentions would end their lives. Their stories remind us of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing the time we have with the people we love. The case also demonstrates the dedication of law enforcement professionals who work tirelessly to solve complex crimes and bring justice to families who have suffered unimaginable losses. The investigators who worked on the Lost Boys case spent countless hours searching for evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building the cases that eventually led to convictions. In the quiet hills of Bucks County, where stone houses still dot the landscape and families continue to farm the fertile soil, the memory of the Lost Boys lives on. Their deaths were a tragedy that shocked the community, but their lives continue to be celebrated by those who knew and loved them. As we reach the end of this story, we remember 4 young men whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. Dean Finocchiaro, with his infectious smile and skateboarding passion. Mark Sturgis, gentle and kind-hearted, always ready to help others. Thomas Mio, loyal and funny, someone who would drive hours to help a friend. And Jimmy Taro, Patrick, creative and dreamful, taken before he could fulfill his potential. Their families continue to honor their memories through foundations, community service, and acts of kindness. They've channeled their grief into efforts to help others and prevent similar tragedies. In doing so, they've ensured that while the Lost Boys of Bucks County were taken too soon, their impact on the world continues. The peaceful farmlands of Bucks County have seen many stories over the centuries. Stories of families building lives, of seasons changing, of communities growing and evolving. The story of the Lost Boys is one of the darker chapters in that long history, but it's also a testament to the resilience of families and communities in the face of unthinkable tragedy. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps take a moment to think about the people you love and the ordinary moments that make up our lives. The Lost Boys of Bucks County remind us that those ordinary moments are precious, and that the people we share them with are irreplaceable. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. The warm Florida night of January 22nd, 1980, held no warning of the tragedy that would unfold in the quiet mobile home park of Miramar. In a small, modest home, a 32-year-old woman named Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamforth was preparing for bed, unaware that this would be her final evening. What happened in the early hours of that winter morning would remain a mystery for over 4 decades. A cold case that would span generations of investigators, surviving family members, and ultimately lead to one of the oldest solved murders in Miramar's history. Evelyn's story began far from the palm trees and humid air of South Florida. She was born and raised in the picturesque town of Chilliwack, British Columbia, where the Fraser River winds through fertile valleys and the coast mountains rise majestically in the distance. It was a place where neighbors knew each other's names, where children rode bicycles down tree-lined streets without fear, and where young women like Evelyn could dream of adventures beyond the familiar boundaries of their small-town existence. In Chilliwack, Evelyn had built a life that spoke to her caring nature and desire to help others. She had chosen nursing as her profession, a calling that required not just medical knowledge, but genuine compassion for those in their most vulnerable moments. Her colleagues would later remember her as someone who possessed that rare combination of clinical skill and emotional warmth that made her patients feel truly cared for. She had the kind of gentle hands and reassuring voice that could calm a frightened child or comfort an elderly patient facing their final days. But life has a way of leading us down unexpected paths, and for Evelyn that path led south to Florida. Perhaps it was the promise of year-round warmth, the opportunity for a fresh start, or simply the call of adventure that drew her away from the familiar mountains and forests of her Canadian home. Whatever the reason, by 1980 she had established herself in Miramar, a growing suburban community in Broward County, where she worked as a nurse and was known by her married name, Fisher Bamforth. The mobile home where Evelyn lived represented the kind of modest, practical dwelling that suited a young professional building her career. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was hers. A place where she could come home after long shifts at the hospital, where she could unwind and find peace after days spent caring for others. The mobile home park itself was the kind of community where residents looked out for one another, where the sound of children playing mixed with the gentle hum of air conditioning units and the occasional bark of a dog. On that fateful January evening, Evelyn had likely followed her usual routine. Perhaps she had worked a shift at the hospital, tending to patients who depended on her expertise and kindness. Maybe she had stopped at the grocery store on her way home, picking up essentials for the week ahead. She might have called friends or family, maintaining those important connections that kept her tethered to the people who mattered most in her life. These small, everyday details, the ordinary moments that make up a life, would soon take on a poignant significance in light of what was to come. As night settled over the mobile home park, Evelyn prepared for sleep. Trusting in the basic security that most of us take for granted, she locked her doors, perhaps drew her curtains, and settled into bed, expecting nothing more than a peaceful night's rest before another day of work and life. But somewhere in the darkness outside, a predator was moving with malicious intent, about to shatter not just her sense of safety, but her very existence. The details of what happened next are the kind that haunt investigators for decades. Sometime in the early hours of January 22nd, 1980, an intruder forced his way into Evelyn's home. The evidence would later reveal that this was not a random burglary gone wrong, but a calculated and brutal attack. The intruder had come with violence in mind, and Evelyn, awakened from sleep, found herself trapped in a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The assault that followed was both sexual and physical, carried out with a cruelty that speaks to the darkest corners of human nature. Evelyn, a woman who had dedicated her professional life to healing and helping others, became the victim of someone who seemed to embody the complete opposite of everything she represented. In those terrible moments, as she fought for her life in the home that should have been her sanctuary, Evelyn faced evil in its most raw and unforgiving form. When the violence finally ended, Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamforth was dead, her life cut short at just 32 years old. The crime scene that investigators would soon discover told the story of a woman who had fought bravely against her attacker, but who had ultimately been overpowered by someone determined to destroy her. The physical evidence painted a picture of extreme violence, of a murder that was as senseless as it was brutal. The discovery of Evelyn's body sent shockwaves through the mobile home park. In the broader Miramar community, news of the murder spread quickly through the tight-knit neighborhood, leaving residents to grapple with the terrifying realization that such violence could strike so close to home. Suddenly, the simple act of sleeping peacefully in one's own bed seemed less certain, less secure. The murder had torn a hole in the fabric of the community's sense of safety, one that would take years to heal. For the Miramar Police Department, Evelyn's murder represented both a tragedy and a challenge. In 1980, forensic science was far less advanced than it would later become. DNA analysis was still in its experimental stages, not yet the powerful investigative tool it would eventually prove to be. Detectives had to rely on traditional methods, witness interviews, fingerprint analysis, and old-fashioned police work to try to identify Evelyn's killer. The initial investigation was thorough, but ultimately frustrating. Detectives canvassed the mobile home park, interviewing neighbors who might have seen or heard anything unusual that night. They processed the crime scene meticulously, collecting every piece of physical evidence that might one day prove useful. They followed leads, questioned potential suspects, and worked tirelessly to find the person responsible for Evelyn's death. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the case grew cold. Despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators, Evelyn's killer remained free, his identity a mystery that seemed increasingly unlikely to be solved. The case file grew thick with reports and evidence, but the crucial breakthrough, the one piece of information that would point definitively to the perpetrator, remained elusive. For Evelyn's family back in Chilliwack, her death was a wound that would never fully heal. Her obituary, published in the Chilliwack Progress on February 6, 1980, spoke of a beloved daughter, sister, and friend whose life had been cut tragically short. The words on the page could hardly capture the magnitude of their loss. The future conversations that would never happen. The family gatherings where her chair would remain empty. The grandchildren she would never have the chance to hold. Her widower faced his own private hell, dealing not just with the grief of losing his wife, but with the torment of knowing that somewhere out there, her killer walked free. For the families of murder victims, this uncertainty adds another layer of suffering to their grief. They cannot truly mourn and find closure while the person responsible remains unidentified and unpunished. Years passed, and Evelyn's case joined the ranks of thousands of unsolved murders across the country. Detectives retired, new investigators took over, and files were transferred from one generation of law enforcement to the next. The physical evidence was carefully preserved, stored in climate-controlled facilities where it waited patiently for science to catch up with the demands of justice. The 1980s gave way to the 1990s, and still there were no answers. The mobile home park where Evelyn had lived continued to house new residents, many of whom had no idea of the tragedy that had once occurred there. Life moved on, as it must, but the questions surrounding Evelyn's death remained as persistent as they were painful. It was during this period that advances in forensic science began to offer new hope for cold cases like Evelyn's. DNA analysis, which had been experimental in 1980, was becoming more sophisticated and reliable. Law enforcement agencies across the country began to realize that evidence collected decades earlier might now hold the key to solving long cold cases. The process of re-examining old evidence is painstaking work, requiring both technological expertise and investigative persistence. For the Miramar Police Department, Evelyn's case remained a priority despite the passage of time. The department's cold case investigators understood that while justice delayed is justice denied, it is never too late to seek accountability for the taking of a human life. As the new millennium arrived, DNA technology continued to evolve at a rapid pace. What had once required large samples and perfect preservation conditions could now be accomplished with increasingly small amounts of genetic material. Cold case squads across the nation began systematically reviewing their oldest unsolved murders, looking for cases where DNA evidence might finally provide answers. The breakthrough in Evelyn's case would come not from a single moment of inspiration, but from the methodical application of advancing science to carefully preserved evidence. Somewhere in the physical evidence collected from her mobile home in 1980, genetic material from her killer had been waiting for more than 4 decades to tell its story. The man whose DNA would eventually be matched to the evidence from Evelyn's murder was already well known to law enforcement, though not in connection with her case. Ronald Eugene Richards had been living a life that straddled the line between freedom and incarceration, his name appearing in criminal databases for reasons that would later prove grimly relevant to Evelyn's story. Richards's criminal history painted a picture of a man comfortable with violence, particularly violence directed at women. Court records would later reveal that he had been convicted in 1982 for another horrific crime, an attempted murder and sexual assault that had occurred in Volusia County, Florida, in March 1980. The timing was significant. Just 2 months after Evelyn's murder, Richards had struck again, following a similar pattern of breaking into a home and attacking a woman. The fact that Richards had committed another violent crime so soon after Evelyn's murder suggests that her death was not an isolated incident of violence, but part of a pattern of predatory behavior. For investigators, this revelation added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case. It raised the possibility that if Evelyn's killer had been caught in 1980, another woman might have been spared the trauma of Richards' later attack. Richards had been sentenced to 50 years in prison for the Volusia County crime, a sentence that had kept him behind bars for decades. By the time DNA evidence linked him to Evelyn's murder, he was 75 years old, his hair gray, his body bearing the marks of age and imprisonment. But the passage of time had not diminished the impact of what he had done to Evelyn Fisher Bamforth on that January night. The process of building a case against Richards, after so many years, required investigators to reconstruct not just the facts of the crime, but the entire context surrounding it. They had to locate witnesses who were still alive and whose memories, though faded, might still contain crucial details. They had to verify the chain of custody for evidence that had been stored for 4 decades. They had to work with prosecutors to ensure that the case they presented would meet the demanding standards required for a conviction. On November 30th, 2022, more than 42 years after Evelyn's murder, a grand jury in Broward County issued an indictment against Ronald Eugene Richards. The charges were severe and appropriate to the crime. first-degree murder, and sexual battery. For the Miramar Police Department, it represented the culmination of decades of work and the resolution of what they considered the oldest cold case in the city's history. The announcement of Richard's indictment was met with a mixture of relief and renewed grief from those who had never forgotten Evelyn. For her widower, now an elderly man himself, the news brought a bittersweet sense that justice might finally be served, even though it could never bring back the wife he had lost so many years ago. In a statement to the media, he expressed both gratitude for the investigators' persistence and the enduring pain of his loss. For the investigators who had worked on Evelyn's case over the decades, the indictment represented validation of their commitment to seeking justice regardless of how much time had passed. Detective work on cold cases requires a special kind of dedication, the ability to care deeply about victims they may never have met, to pursue leads that may lead nowhere, and to maintain hope even when a case seems unsolvable. The legal proceedings that followed the indictment moved through the court system with the measured pace that characterizes complex criminal cases. Richards, now an elderly inmate serving time for his previous conviction, faced the prospect of standing trial for a murder he had allegedly committed decades earlier. The evidence against him was primarily scientific, DNA analysis that had not been possible at the time of the crime, but was now considered virtually irrefutable. For prosecutors, cases based heavily on DNA evidence present both advantages and challenges. The science is generally quite strong, providing a level of certainty that traditional evidence often cannot match. However, proving not just that a defendant's DNA was present at a crime scene, but that they committed the crime, still requires careful presentation of evidence and clear explanation to a jury. As the case moved toward trial, both sides prepared for what would likely be a complex legal battle. The prosecution had to overcome the challenges inherent in any decades-old case: missing witnesses, faded memories, and the simple fact that many people connected to the original investigation were no longer available to testify. The defense faced the daunting task of challenging DNA evidence that appeared to conclusively link their client to the crime. However, the case would not proceed to trial. On April 8, 2024, Ronald Eugene Richards made a decision that would bring Evelyn's case to a definitive close. In a courtroom in Broward County, the 76-year-old Richards stood before a judge and entered a plea of no contest to the charges against him. A no contest plea, while not an admission of guilt, has the same legal effect as a guilty plea. It represents a defendant's decision not to fight the charges, allowing the court to proceed directly to sentencing. For Richards, who was already serving time for his previous conviction, the plea deal offered him a measure of certainty about his fate. Under the terms of the plea agreement, Richards was sentenced to 12 years in prison for Evelyn's murder. While some might view this as a relatively light sentence for such a serious crime, several factors likely influenced the agreement. Richards' advanced age meant that he might not live to serve a longer sentence. The challenges of prosecuting a 4-decade-old case, even with DNA evidence, may have made a plea deal preferable to the risks of trial. And for Evelyn's family, the certainty of conviction and the knowledge that her killer would die in prison may have outweighed the desire for a longer sentence. The conclusion of Richards' case marked the end of one of the longest-running investigations in Miramar's history. For the community that had been touched by Evelyn's murder, it provided a sense of closure that had been absent for over 40 years. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. The story of Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamforth's murder and the eventual conviction of her killer illustrates both the limitations and the power of the criminal justice system. In 1980, despite the best efforts of dedicated investigators, the available technology was simply not sufficient to identify her killer. But the careful preservation of evidence and the persistence of law enforcement professionals meant that when technology advanced, justice remained possible. For families of murder victims, particularly those whose cases remain unsolved, Evelyn's story offers both hope and a sobering reminder of how long the journey to justice can be. The advancement of DNA technology has made it possible to solve cases that were once considered hopeless. But it requires patience, resources, and the kind of institutional commitment that keeps cold cases active even when decades have passed. The mobile home park where Evelyn lived and died has undoubtedly changed in the decades since 1980. New residents have moved in, families have been raised, and lives have been lived in the shadow of a tragedy that many current residents may know nothing about. But for those who remember and for the investigators who never gave up, Evelyn's story serves as a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes to achieve it. In the quiet moments of a Florida evening, when the sun sets over the suburban landscapes of Miramar, it's worth remembering Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamforth. She was a woman who chose a profession dedicated to healing others, who traveled far from home to build a new life, and who deserved to live that life in safety and peace. Though her life was cut short by violence, her story ultimately became one of perseverance. The perseverance of those who loved her, of the investigators who refused to give up, and of a system of justice that, however imperfectly, eventually held her killer accountable. The forensic evidence that finally solved Evelyn's case represents more than just scientific advancement. It represents the power of hope sustained over decades. Every piece of evidence carefully preserved, every witness interview conducted, every lead followed, contributed to the eventual resolution of her case. In a world where justice can seem elusive and where the worst crimes sometimes go unpunished, Evelyn's story stands as a testament to the possibility that truth will eventually emerge, even when it takes nearly half a century to do so. For Ronald Eugene Richards, now in his 70s, and facing the remainder of his life behind bars, his conviction for Evelyn's murder represents the final accounting for a crime committed in his younger years. Whether he feels remorse for what he did that January night in 1980 is known only to him, but his plea of no contest at least acknowledges the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The resolution of Evelyn's case also highlights the importance of supporting law enforcement's efforts to solve cold cases. These investigations require significant resources, specialized personnel, advanced technology, and the institutional commitment to pursue justice even when years have passed without progress. They require police departments to maintain evidence storage facilities, to train investigators in the latest forensic techniques, and to prioritize cases that may not generate headlines but matter deeply to the families affected. As we reflect on Evelyn's story, we're reminded that behind every criminal case is a human being whose life had value, whose death created ripples of grief that extended far beyond the immediate crime scene. Evelyn was someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's colleague and friend. She was a nurse who spent her days caring for others, who chose a profession that required both skill and compassion. Her murder represented not just the loss of one life, but the loss of all the good she might have done, all the patience she might have comforted, all the love she might have given and received in the years stolen from her. The technology that eventually solved Evelyn's case continues to evolve, offering hope for the resolution of other cold cases that have languished for decades. Forensic genealogy, improved DNA analysis techniques, and artificial intelligence applications in criminal investigation are opening new possibilities for connecting evidence to suspects. For the families of victims whose cases remain unsolved, these advances represent reasons for continued hope. But technology alone is not enough. Solving cold cases requires the human element. Investigators who care enough to spend years pursuing leads, prosecutors willing to take on challenging cases, and communities that remember victims and demand accountability. It requires the kind of institutional memory that keeps cases active, even when the original investigators have retired and the immediate public attention has faded. In the end, the story of Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamforth's murder is both deeply tragic and ultimately hopeful. It's tragic because a young woman's life was cut short by senseless violence, because her family and friends had to live for decades without answers, and because her killer remained free for so long. But it's hopeful because it demonstrates that justice, however delayed, is still possible, that evidence carefully preserved can eventually speak, that investigators' dedication can eventually pay off, and that the arc of justice, though long, can indeed bend toward accountability. As this story comes to its close, in the quiet hours when sleep beckons and the day's concerns fade into darkness, we can remember Evelyn Fisher Bamforth, not just as a victim, but as a person who mattered, whose life had meaning, and whose story ultimately became a testament to the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Though she has been gone for more than 4 decades, her story lives on as a reminder that every victim deserves to be remembered, every case deserves to be pursued, and every family deserves answers, no matter how long those answers may take to arrive. In the gentle quiet of night, as we settle into our own beds and trust in our own safety, we can honor Evelyn's memory by remembering that such safety is precious, that those who work to protect it deserve our support, and that justice, though sometimes slow, remains one of humanity's highest aspirations. Her story ends not with her death, but with the eventual accountability of the one who took her life. A reminder that in the long arc of justice, truth has a way of emerging, even from the darkest of circumstances. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a case that shocked Los Angeles in November 2021. The tragic deaths of two young women whose lives were cut short during what should have been a simple night out with friends. This is the story of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola, two bright souls whose paths crossed in the sprawling city of Los Angeles, forming a friendship that would tragically end in one of the most disturbing cases the city has seen in recent years. It's a story about dreams, friendship, and the dangerous predators who lurk in the shadows of Hollywood's glittering facade. Let's begin with Christy Lee Giles Cilliers, a 24-year-old woman with dreams as bright as the California sun. Christy had made her way to Los Angeles with aspirations that drew so many to the City of Angels. She wanted to be a model and an actress. With her striking looks and determined spirit, she had begun to carve out a place for herself in the competitive world of entertainment. Christy wasn't alone in her journey. She had married Jan Cilliers, and together they were building a life in Los Angeles. Like many couples drawn to the entertainment industry, they supported each other's dreams, while navigating the complexities of a city where success often felt tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly elusive. But modeling and acting weren't Christy's only interests. She had also begun studying interior design, perhaps as a practical backup to her entertainment aspirations, or simply because she had an eye for beauty and space. This detail would become significant later, as it connected her to our second victim. Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola was 26 years old, an accomplished architect and interior designer who had recently made the significant decision to move from Mexico to Los Angeles. At 26, Hilda was pursuing her own American dream, bringing her professional skills and creative vision to a new country. She was talented, ambitious, and ready to make her mark in Los Angeles' competitive design scene. The move from Mexico to Los Angeles represented a huge leap of faith for Hilda. Like so many immigrants before her, she was leaving behind the familiar, her family, her established life, her native language as a primary means of communication, to chase opportunity in a city known for both making and breaking dreams. It was through their shared interest in interior design that Christy and Hilda's paths crossed. In a city of millions, two young women with complementary skills and similar dreams found each other and formed what appeared to be a genuine friendship. Christy, the aspiring actress studying design, and Hilda, the professional architect and interior designer. They seemed like a natural partnership. November 12, 2021, started like any other Friday night in Los Angeles. The city pulsed with its usual energy. Restaurants filled with diners, bars crowded with those looking to unwind from the week, and various parties and events scattered across the sprawling metropolis. For Christy and Hilda, it was going to be a girls' night out. These were two young professional women who had been working hard on their respective careers, and they deserved some time to relax and enjoy themselves. The plan was simple: go out, have some fun, maybe dance, maybe meet some new people, and then head home safely. Neither woman could have imagined that this would be the last time their loved ones would ever hear from them. The evening began innocuously enough. The two friends made their preparations, choosing their outfits, doing their makeup, and getting ready for what they expected to be an enjoyable night on the town. Christy, ever the loving wife, stayed in touch with her husband Jan throughout the evening, sending him photos and messages. One of these photos would later become heartbreakingly significant. It was the last photo Christy would ever send to her husband. A simple snapshot that captured a moment of happiness and normalcy, completely unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Their destination that night was a warehouse party. Los Angeles is famous for these kinds of events: large, often unofficial gatherings in industrial spaces, where the music is loud, the atmosphere is electric, and people from all walks of life come together to dance and socialize. For two young women looking to have a good time, it probably seemed like the perfect place to spend a Friday night. At this warehouse party, Christy and Hilda would encounter a man named David Brian Pierce. To those who met him casually, Pierce might have seemed like an ordinary part of the Los Angeles entertainment scene. He described himself as a film producer, and in a city where everyone seemed to be involved in the industry in some capacity. This wouldn't have raised any immediate red flags. David Pierce was 39 years old at the time, older than both Christy and Hilda, and he likely presented himself as someone established in the entertainment world. The kind of person who might be able to help two ambitious young women advance their careers. In Hollywood, networking is everything, and meeting a producer at a party could seem like a stroke of luck. But David Pierce was not what he appeared to be. Behind his facade as a Hollywood producer lurked something much darker and more dangerous. To understand what happened to Christy and Hilda, we need to understand who David Pierce really was. While he may have presented himself as a legitimate film producer, the truth was far more sinister. David Pierce was a predator who had been operating in the shadows of Los Angeles for years. The charges that would eventually be brought against him revealed a pattern of behavior that stretched back to 2007, a 14-year span of alleged sexual assault and violence against women. Pierce didn't work alone. He was part of a network that included Brent Walter Osborne, a 42-year-old actor who had appeared in several low-budget productions. While Osborne would later be charged as an accessory after the fact rather than with murder itself, his involvement suggests that Pierce's crimes were not solo endeavors, but part of a more organized pattern of predatory behavior. The third person who would eventually be arrested in connection with this case was Michael Ansbach, 47 years old. The exact nature of Ansbach's involvement would become clearer as the investigation unfolded. But his arrest indicates that what happened to Christy and Hilda was not a spontaneous crime, but potentially part of a calculated scheme. These three men, Pierce, Osborne, and Ansbach, represent a terrifying reality about predators in environments like Los Angeles' party scene. They don't always look like monsters. They often present themselves as successful, connected individuals who might be able to help advance someone's career. They use their perceived status and connections as weapons, luring victims with promises or simply the suggestion of opportunity. For young women trying to make it in Los Angeles, the entertainment industry can feel like a maze where knowing the right people is essential for success. Predators like Pierce exploit this desperation, using the city's networking culture as a hunting ground. What exactly happened that night after Christy and Hilda encountered David Pierce and his associates remains in many ways known only to the perpetrators, but the physical evidence tells a horrifying story of drugging, assault, and murder. According to the coroner's office findings, both women were given a toxic cocktail of drugs that would ultimately prove fatal. Christy Giles died from a mixture of cocaine, fentanyl, gamma-hydroxyburic acid, GHB, and ketamine. The presence of GHB is particularly significant. This drug is commonly known as a date rape drug because of its ability to incapacitate victims and cause memory loss. Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola's death was caused by multiple organ failure, with cocaine, methylenedioxymethamphetamine, commonly known as ecstasy or MDMA, and other undetermined drugs found in her system. The combination of drugs found in both women's systems suggests a deliberate attempt to incapacitate them. This wasn't a case of accidental overdose or voluntary drug use gone wrong. This was systematic drugging with substances known for their ability to render victims helpless. The charges that would eventually be brought against David Pierce paint an even more disturbing picture. Beyond the murder charges for both women's deaths, Pierce was also charged with 3 counts of forcible rape and 1 count of sexual penetration by use of force. The evidence suggests that after drugging the women, Pierce sexually assaulted them before their deaths. This wasn't Pierce's first time using this horrific modus operandi. The additional charges against him included 7 counts of sexual assault involving 7 different women, with alleged crimes dating back as far as 2007. This revealed a pattern of behavior that had been occurring for over a decade. Pierce had been drugging and assaulting women for years, and Christy and Hilda became his latest victims. But with a tragic difference. This time, his actions resulted in murder. What happened in the hours immediately following the drugging and assault of Christy and Hilda remains partially shrouded in darkness, but the facts that emerged paint a picture of callous disregard for human life. Rather than call for medical help when it became clear that the women were in serious medical distress, Pierce and his accomplices made a calculated decision that would shock investigators and the public alike. They decided to dump the dying women at hospitals, apparently hoping to make their deaths look like accidental overdoses. But even this plan revealed their cowardice and complete lack of humanity. They didn't simply drive the women to the nearest emergency room and carry them inside, calling for help. Instead, they dressed as masked men and used a vehicle without license plates, clearly attempting to avoid identification while disposing of what they apparently viewed as evidence of their crimes. The 2 women were taken to separate hospitals. Christy Giles was dumped outside a hospital in Culver City, while Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola was left at a different facility. The decision to separate them suggests a deliberate attempt to complicate any potential investigation. If the women were found at different locations, it might be harder for authorities to connect their cases. For Christy, the damage was already too severe. She was pronounced dead shortly after being discovered outside the Culver City Hospital. The toxic combination of drugs in her system had already done its fatal work. Hilda's situation was different, but equally tragic. She was still alive when she was found, and medical personnel were able to resuscitate her. For a brief moment there might have been hope. Hope that she would survive. Hope that she might be able to tell investigators what had happened. Hope that justice might be served. But the damage to Hilda's body was catastrophic. She was placed on life support as her organs began to fail. One by one, her family rushed to be by her side, clinging to whatever hope remained. For nearly 2 weeks, they maintained a vigil, praying for a miracle that would never come. On November 24, 2021, the decision was made to take Hilda off life support. She died that day, one day before her 27th birthday. The cruel timing of her death added another layer of heartbreak to an already devastating tragedy. Instead of celebrating another year of life, her family found themselves planning a funeral. From the very beginning, investigators suspected that the deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola were not accidental overdoses. The circumstances of how they were found, dumped by masked men at separate hospitals, immediately raised red flags. Los Angeles police began investigating the case as potential homicides, well before the coroner's office would officially rule the deaths as such. The behavior of whoever had dumped the women was not consistent with friends or acquaintances trying to help someone in medical distress. Friends don't put on masks and remove license plates before taking someone to the hospital. The investigation faced immediate challenges. The perpetrators had clearly taken steps to avoid identification. The masks, the missing license plates, the separation of the victims, and the choice to dump rather than properly deliver the women for medical care all suggested a calculated attempt to cover their tracks. However, they hadn't counted on the determination of the victims' families, particularly Christy's husband, Jan Cilliers. Rather than waiting for the police investigation to unfold at its own pace, Jan took matters into his own hands and began conducting his own investigation into his wife's death. Jan's investigation would prove crucial to the case. He started by retracing Christy's steps on the night she died, using social media, phone records, and witness accounts to piece together his wife's final hours. This wasn't just a grieving husband searching for answers. This was a methodical investigation that would provide crucial leads for law enforcement. Through his efforts, Gian was able to identify some of the people his wife had encountered on her final night, including David Pierce. This information would become vital to the police investigation, providing them with specific individuals to focus on rather than having to start from scratch with no leads. The digital age proved to be both a blessing and a curse for criminals like Pierce. While technology provided new ways to cover tracks and hide identities, it also created digital footprints that could be followed by determined investigators. Cell phone records, social media posts, digital photos, and other electronic evidence would all play crucial roles in building the case against Pierce and his accomplices. In modern criminal investigations, digital evidence often provides the breakthrough that traditional detective work cannot. The case of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola would be no exception. Investigators began analyzing cell phone records, looking for connections between the victims and potential suspects. They examined social media posts from the night in question, searching for photos, videos, or messages that might provide clues about what happened. The digital trail also included analyzing the victim's own phones and social media accounts. Remember, Christy had been sending photos and messages to her husband throughout the evening. These communications provided investigators with the timeline and potentially crucial information about whom she had encountered and where she had been. Location data from cell phones proved particularly valuable. In the modern era, our phones constantly track our movements, creating a digital map of everywhere we go. For investigators, this meant they could potentially track not only where Christy and Hilda had been, but also where their suspected attackers had gone both before and after the crime. The investigation also revealed the broader pattern of David Pierce's alleged crimes. As investigators dug deeper into his background, they discovered that Christy and Hilda were not his only alleged victims. The 7 additional charges of sexual assault against 7 different women, dating back to 2007, painted a picture of a serial predator who had been operating in Los Angeles for over a decade. This discovery was both horrifying and helpful to the investigation. While it revealed that more women had suffered at Pierce's hands, it also provided investigators with additional evidence, and potentially more witnesses who could testify about his pattern of behavior. The digital evidence and witness testimony began to paint a clear picture of what had happened on November 12, 2021. It showed how Pierce had encountered the two women, how they had ended up in his company, and what had transpired in the hours that followed. The investigation into the deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola culminated in a series of arrests that would bring the case into the public spotlight. David Brian Pierce, the alleged ringleader, was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the rape and deaths of both women. The first-degree murder charges indicated that prosecutors believed Pierce had planned and intentionally caused their deaths, rather than their deaths being an accidental consequence of assault or drugging. In addition to the murder charges, Pierce faced 3 counts of forcible rape and 1 count of sexual penetration by use of force related to the attacks on Christy and Hilda. But the charges didn't stop there. As the investigation had revealed, Pierce's alleged crimes extended far beyond the deaths of these 2 women. He was also charged with 7 additional counts of sexual assault, involving 7 different women, with these alleged crimes dating back as far as 2000. Grant Walter Osborne, the 42-year-old actor, was charged with 2 counts of accessory after the fact in connection with the deaths of both women. While he wasn't charged with murder itself, the accessory charges suggested that prosecutors believed he had helped Pierce cover up the crimes after they occurred. The third arrest was Michael Ansbach, though the specific charges against him would become clearer as the legal proceedings advanced. The arrest brought some measure of relief to the families of Christy and Hilda, though nothing could truly ease their pain. Los Angeles County District Attorney George Giscon acknowledged this reality when he announced the charges, stating that he recognized the charges were a small consolation to the friends and family members of the victims. District Attorney Gascon also made a public appeal for other potential victims to come forward. This was a recognition that based on the charges and evidence they had uncovered, there might be additional victims who hadn't yet spoken with authorities. In cases involving serial predators, it's common for there to be more victims than initially known, and law enforcement often relies on the publicity around arrests to encourage other victims to step forward. The path from arrest to trial in a complex murder case like this one is never simple or quick. The legal proceedings would stretch over several years, with various motions, hearings, and legal challenges along the way. David Pierce initially planned to plead not guilty to all charges, which is standard in serious criminal cases. This meant that the case would go to trial, where prosecutors would have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial itself would be a test of the digital evidence that investigators had gathered, as well as the testimony of witnesses and experts. Prosecutors would need to prove not only that Pierce had caused the deaths of Christy and Hilda, but that he had done so with malice aforethought, the legal standard for first-degree murder. The presence of multiple drugs in both victim systems would be crucial evidence. Prosecutors would argue that the combination and quantities of drugs found in the women's bodies could not have been accidental or self-administered, but rather represented a deliberate attempt to incapacitate them. The charges of rape and sexual assault would also be central to the prosecution's case, as they would help establish motive and show a pattern of predatory behavior. The additional charges involving 7 other women would be particularly important, as they could demonstrate to the jury that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing pattern of violence against women. For the defense, the challenge would be significant, with physical evidence, digital evidence, and potentially multiple witness testimonies against their client. They would need to create reasonable doubt about either Pierce's involvement or his intent. The trial would also need to address the roles of the co-defendants, particularly Brant Osborne, who was charged as an accessory after the fact. Prosecutors would need to show exactly how Osborne had helped cover up the crimes, while his defense would likely argue that he was either not involved or not aware of the full extent of what had occurred. The legal proceedings in the case of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola reached their conclusion in February 2025, nearly 3.5 years after the women's deaths. On February 5, 2025, a jury found David Brian Pierce guilty on all charges. The conviction included 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of both women, 3 counts of forcible rape, and 1 count of sexual penetration by use of force. The jury's unanimous verdict represented a complete victory for prosecutors, and, more importantly, a measure of justice for the families of Christy and Hilda. The first-degree murder convictions were particularly significant, because they indicated that the jury believed Pierce had not only caused the women's deaths but had done so with premeditation and malice. This wasn't a case of accidental death during the commission of another crime. This was murder in the first degree. However, the legal proceedings had different outcomes for the co-defendants. While Pierce was convicted, there was a mistrial in the case against Brent Osborne. This meant that while prosecutors had successfully proven their case against the main perpetrator, questions remained about the exact level of involvement of his alleged accomplices. The conviction brought a sense of closure to the families of both victims, though nothing could truly heal the wounds left by such senseless violence. For Jan Cilliers, Christie's husband, who had worked tirelessly to investigate his wife's death, the conviction represented the successful conclusion of a long and painful journey toward justice. For Hilda's family, who had traveled from Mexico to be present for the legal proceedings, the conviction meant that the person responsible for cutting short their daughter's life would be held accountable for his actions. The case also served as a broader reminder about the dangers that women face in social situations, particularly in cities like Los Angeles, where the party scene can provide cover for predators. The fact that Pierce had allegedly been committing similar crimes for over a decade highlighted the importance of believing victims and thoroughly investigating reports of sexual assault. The murders of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola resonated far beyond the Los Angeles area, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in what should be safe social environments. The case highlighted several troubling realities about predatory behavior in urban party scenes. First, it showed how predators can use perceived status and connections in industries like entertainment to lure victims. David Pierce's presentation of himself as a film producer was likely a key factor in gaining the trust of his victims. As second, the case demonstrated the calculated nature of predatory behavior. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a systematic approach involving drugging, assault, and ultimately murder, with attempts to cover up the crimes afterward. The involvement of multiple co-defendants also showed that these kinds of crimes sometimes involve networks of individuals rather than lone perpetrators. The fact that Pierce had allegedly been committing similar crimes for over a decade without being stopped raises difficult questions about how such patterns of behavior can persist undetected. For the families of the victims, the case represented not just personal tragedy but a mission to prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. Both Christy and Hilda were young women with bright futures ahead of them. Christy with her modeling and acting aspirations, Hilda with her architectural career just beginning in a new country. The case also highlighted the crucial role that family members can play in criminal investigations. Jan Cilliers' decision to conduct his own investigation into his wife's death provided crucial leads that helped law enforcement solve the case. His determination to find answers, even in the face of overwhelming grief, exemplified the love and dedication that drive family members to seek justice for their lost loved ones. As we near the end of this tragic tale, it's important to remember that Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola were much more than victims of a horrible crime. They were young women with dreams, ambitions, relationships, and futures that were stolen from them. Christy Lee Giles Cilliers was a 24-year-old model, an aspiring actress who had found love with her husband Jan and was building a life in Los Angeles. Her interest in interior design showed a practical side to complement her entertainment industry ambitions. She was a wife, a friend, and a person who sent loving photos to her husband even during a night out with friends. The last photo she sent to Jen, that simple snapshot from her final evening, serves as a poignant reminder of how quickly life can change. In that moment, she was just a young woman having fun with a friend, completely unaware that her life was about to be cut short by someone who viewed her not as a human being but as a target. Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola was a 26-year-old architect, an interior designer who had made the brave decision to leave her home country of Mexico to pursue opportunities in Los Angeles. Her move represented the kind of courage and ambition that drives people to chase their dreams in new places, even when it means leaving behind everything familiar. Hilda died just one day before her 27th birthday, adding a particularly cruel dimension to an already heartbreaking tragedy. Instead of celebrating another year of life and achievement, her family found themselves saying goodbye to a daughter whose potential would never be fully realized. Both women represented the dreams and aspirations that draw so many people to Los Angeles. They were part of the city's diverse tapestry of young professionals, artists, and entrepreneurs who come seeking opportunity and success. Their deaths served as a violent reminder that predators often target the very people who are most vulnerable, those who are new to a city, those who are trying to network and build careers, those who are simply trying to live their lives and pursue their dreams. As we conclude this true crime story, we're left with the sobering reality that, while justice was ultimately served in the case of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola, Their deaths represent a loss that can never be fully recovered. The conviction of David Pierce for their murders means that he will face the consequences of his actions. But it cannot bring back two young lives that were cut short in their prime. It cannot erase the pain felt by Jan Cilliers, who lost his wife and partner. It cannot comfort Hilda's family in Mexico, who sent their daughter to pursue her dreams in America, only to lose her to senseless violence. What we can take from this case is the importance of looking out for one another, especially in social situations where alcohol and drugs might impair judgment. We can remember the dedication of family members like Jan Cilliers, whose determination to find answers helped bring a killer to justice. We can appreciate the hard work of investigators who use digital evidence and traditional detective work to build a case against a predator who might otherwise have continued harming women. Most importantly, we can remember Christy and Hilda, not just as victims, but as young women who had hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Their lives mattered, their dreams were valid, and their memories deserve to be honored. In Los Angeles, a city of dreams where so many come seeking opportunity and success, their story serves as both a tragedy and a warning. It reminds us that even in our pursuit of our goals and in our efforts to build networks and friendships, we must remain vigilant about the dangers that exist in the shadows. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll spare a thought for two young women whose dreams were cut short by senseless violence, but whose memories live on in the hearts of those who loved them and in the justice that was ultimately served in their names. The case of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcela Cabrales Arzola is now closed, but their stories of ambition, friendship, and lives lived too briefly, continue to resonate as reminders of both the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting those who are vulnerable in our society. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care.